The mountain knew Elijah Torrance's secrets. For 47 days, he'd spoken only to rock and river, to the gold dust that whispered through his sluice boxes at dawn. His hands, scarred from seasons of solitary labor, measured wealth not in ounces but in days avoided from town. Copper Ridge sprawled below like a threat. The railroad station's smoke rose against the valley, modern progress mocking his primitive exile. He counted his gold dust with the mechanical precision of a man who'd learned that numbers, unlike people, never lied, unlike partners who vanished with winter's stake, unlike women who chose comfort over keeping promises. The pack mule waited, indifferent to his master's war between necessity and dread. Supplies wouldn't last another week. The flour was gone, the coal oil nearly spent. Elijah shouldered his Winchester and began the descent, each step a small betrayal of the sanctuary that loneliness had built. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The Copper Ridge station platform teemed with the usual morning chaos, passengers disembarking, freight being loaded, the wheeze and clank of the locomotive catching its breath. Elijah had timed his arrival deliberately, hoping to lose himself in the crowd, to complete his business unnoticed. But the cluster of townspeople gathered near the baggage car drew his attention like a drawn pistol. Their laughter carried the cruel edge he recognized from schoolyards and saloons, the sound of the strong amusing themselves with another's misfortune. Through the gaps between shoulders and Sunday hats, he glimpsed her. She sat on a steamer trunk with brass corners that gleamed despite the layer of trail dust. Her dress, navy bombazine that had likely cost more than his monthly supplies, bore the wrinkles of 3 days' travel. The whalebone corset, visible through a torn seam at her shoulder, still held her posture rigid as cathedral stonework. But it was her face that stopped him, not beautiful by conventional measure, fuller than fashion dictated, yet possessed of a dignity that made the crowd's mockery seem like children throwing pebbles at a fortress. Came all the way from St. Louis, the station master announced to anyone within earshot, relishing his role as narrator of misfortune. Mr. James Harriman took one look at her stepping off that train and caught the return locomotive before it finished taking on water, left her standing there with her mouth open like a caught fish. The church women tittered behind their gloves. Perhaps if she'd been honest about her proportions in her correspondence. Mrs. DeWitt suggested, loud enough to carry. The woman on the trunk, Margaret, Elijah would later learn, held a telegram in her left hand, even from 20 feet away. He could see how her fingers had worried the paper soft. Her right hand lay flat on her knee, steadying herself against more than just the platform's subtle sway. She hadn't spoken a word in her own defense, hadn't wept, hadn't raged. She simply sat, as if she'd calculated the exact amount of energy required to maintain composure and refused to spend 1 grain more. That's when their eyes met. Elijah had seen that look before. In his own reflection, the morning after Thomas had disappeared with their gold and Sarah had left that note saying she'd gone with him. It was the look of someone who'd wagered their last dollar on what seemed like a sure hand, only to discover the deck had been marked from the beginning. Not surprise at betrayal, that would come later, if at all, but the bitter recognition that hope had made a fool of them again. He pushed through the crowd with the same determination he used to break through river ice. The townspeople parted, perhaps recognizing something dangerous in his approach, something that suggested their entertainment was about to end. Up close, he could see the tear tracks through the trail dust on her cheeks, though no fresh ones fell. Her eyes, brown as winter bark, met his without plea or expectation. She'd moved past hoping for rescue. He recognized that too, without a word. Elijah pulled his handkerchief from his pocket, clean, because he'd planned to visit the bank, and offered it to her. She studied it for a moment as if it might be some new form of mockery, then accepted it with a nod that managed to convey both gratitude and wariness. "The telegram," she said, her voice rougher than her appearance suggested, weathered by 3 days of train smoke and unshed tears. "He wrote arrangements unsuitable," as if I were a shipment of goods that didn't match the catalog description. She showed him the crumpled message, the brevity of cruelty, just those 2 words and the initials JB. somehow made it worse. At least when Sarah had left, she'd attempted explanation, excuses, lies to soften the blow. This was dismissal without even the courtesy of elaboration. "Hungry?" Elijah heard himself ask. The question surprised him more than her. Cafes still serving breakfast, nothing fancy, but Molly's biscuits could patch bullet holes. Margaret studied him then, really looked at him for the first time. Saw the carefully mended tears in his canvas pants, the way he stood slightly apart even when addressing her directly, the calculation in his own eyes that measured cost against benefit in every human interaction. "I haven't eaten since St. Louis," she admitted. "I was too nervous, and then there didn't seem much point." "There's always point in eating," Elijah said, offering his hand to help her stand. "World's gonna hurt you anyway. No sense letting it do so on an empty stomach." She surprised him by laughing, just a short breath of air that might have been mistaken for a sigh, but he caught the bitter amusement in it. She took his hand, rose from the trunk with more grace than her exhaustion should have allowed, and smoothed her skirts with her free hand. "Margaret Fletcher," she said, "former bride-to-be, current embarrassment to decent society." "Elijah Torrance," he replied, "mountain hermit, occasional gold panner, permanent disappointment to the same." The crowd had begun to disperse, robbed of their spectacle by this unexpected alliance. Mrs. DeWitt sniffed her disapproval. The station master returned to his duties, though Elijah could feel him watching as they walked toward the cafe. Margaret's trunk remained on the platform like an abandoned monument to failed dreams. "Your trunk," Elijah began, "won't disappear any faster than my prospects," Margaret said. "Besides, I suspect the vultures have had their fill for the morning." They walked side by side, not touching again, but something in their matched pace suggested an understanding that went beyond words. Two people who'd learned the hard way that rock bottom had a basement, and sometimes the only comfort available was the company of someone who wouldn't pretend otherwise. The cafe doorbell chimed their entrance, a peculiarly cheerful sound that seemed to mock everything that had brought them to this moment. But the smell of coffee and bacon grease promised something simpler, a meal, a moment's rest, and perhaps the smallest beginning of whatever came after surviving the unsurvivable. The cafe occupied a narrow slice between the mercantile and the barber shop, its windows fogged with breakfast steam and decades of coal smoke. Molly Henderson, proprietress and sole cook, didn't look up from her griddle when they entered. She'd learned long ago that minding her own business paid better than gossip, though her eyes tracked them to the corner table with professional interest. Margaret sat with her back to the wall, a position Elijah would have chosen himself. The blue enamel coffee pot arrived without their asking, followed by 2 cups that had seen better decades. The coffee, black as mine shaft depths and nearly as bitter, seemed to restore something in Margaret. Color returned to her cheeks, though whether from the heat or returning life, Elijah couldn't say. "I sold everything," she said after the second cup, the words falling like stones into still water. "My mother's furniture, her china, the piano I'd taught lessons on for 6 years, even my father's watch, though he'd specifically willed it to my future husband." She laughed, that same bitter breath from the platform. "I suppose that proved optimistic." The sourdough biscuits arrived, sided with bacon thick as roof shingles and eggs that still held the shape of the pan. Margaret ate with the steady determination of someone who'd learned hunger was patient enough to wait but cruel enough to punish delay. Between bites, she continued her inventory of loss. "The photography studio where I kept books barely paid enough to live on. When James's letters came, promising partnership in his dry goods store, describing this grand life we'd build." She paused, spreading butter on a biscuit with unnecessary precision. "I thought I was trading up, not gambling." "There's a difference, isn't there?" "No," Elijah said, surprising himself with the honesty. "Just a prettier name for the same fool's game. I know the look of someone who gambled everything and lost. Saw it in my shaving mirror for 2 years straight." She studied him over her coffee cup. "What did you lose? Gold claim worth $8,000? A partnership I'd have sworn was solid as bedrock. A woman who wore my ring for 3 years while apparently counting the days until something better came along. He pushed eggs around his plate. Appetite suddenly gone. They left together. Took everything but the claim I'm working now. Too small for their ambitions. They said in the note, like leaving the scraps for the dog. Margaret set down her fork. How long ago? 2 years, 4 months, 17 days. He met her eyes. But who's counting? Someone who knows that betrayal has a specific weight, she said. You can carry it or let it crush you, but you can't put it down. They sat in silence while the cafe filled with the morning shift from the mill, men in canvas and denim, talking about ore yields and shift bosses, filling the air with normality that seemed to exist in a different world from the one Elijah and Margaret occupied. Molly refilled their coffee without being asked, her silence a form of kindness. "What will you do?" Elijah finally asked. "I don't know. I have 47 cents, the clothes I'm wearing, and whatever's in that trunk. The return ticket James so thoughtfully didn't provide would cost $60 I don't have. There's no work here for a woman that maintains any dignity, and precious little that doesn't." She straightened her shoulders. "But I've survived worse with less. Worse than public abandonment in a town that'll never let you forget it. My father died when I was 14. My mother followed 6 months later. Some said from grief, but I knew it was from the tumor she'd hidden for a year because we couldn't afford the doctor anyway. I raised my younger sister on my own, saw her married well, only to have her write that I was an embarrassment now that she'd risen in society." Margaret's voice held no self-pity, just fact laid bare as bone. "So yes, Mr. Torrance, I've survived worse." Elijah set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, the ceramic click against the saucer somehow momentous. What he was about to say would sound like madness. Probably was madness, but madness seemed the only sane response to their mutual catastrophe. "I'm not him," he said. "I don't make promises I won't keep. But I need a partner, someone who can read, write, keep accounts, someone who won't faint at hard work or cold mornings, someone who understands that trust is earned by the teaspoon and lost by the barrel." He took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere near his boots. "Marry me. Today. Now." Margaret's cup stopped halfway to her lips. "I beg your pardon." "Not for love," he clarified quickly. "For practicality. You need a roof and respectability. I need someone I can turn my back on without checking for knife wounds. We both know the worst that can happen because it already has. No surprises, no disappointments. Just a business arrangement between two people with their eyes open." She set down her cup with the same deliberation he'd shown. "You don't know me. I could be a drunk, a thief, a shrew who'll make your life miserable. Are you? No. But then you're already ahead of my last partner." He leaned forward. "Look, I'm offering you half of everything I have, which isn't much, but it's honest. A cabin that doesn't leak, a claim that pays enough to live on, and a partnership with someone who values plain dealing over pretty words. I'm not asking you to love me or pretend this is some grand romance. I'm asking you to build something real with someone who knows the difference." Margaret was quiet for so long he thought she'd refuse. Around them, the cafe continued its morning symphony of clattering plates and rough laughter. Finally, she spoke. "Equal partners. I work beside you. Not for you. I keep the books. Manage the money. Have equal say in decisions. Not your housekeeper, not your servant, not your anything but partner. Agreed. And if it doesn't work, if we find we can't stand the sight of each other, we divide everything fairly and part ways with no drama or betrayal. Agreed." She extended her hand across the table, a business gesture that would have seemed absurd given what they were agreeing to, except it was perhaps the most honest foundation for marriage either had seen. "Then yes," Mr. Torrance, I'll marry you." They shook hands like men concluding a mining deal, though her grip proved firmer than most. Molly, who'd been hovering with the coffee pot, nearly dropped it. "The courthouse is 2 blocks down," Elijah said, standing and leaving money on the table. "Judge Peterson will be there by now. He's married half the territory, usually with more notice but less honesty than we're giving him." Margaret rose, smoothing her skirts one final time. "My trunk, Yanai, will be safe at the station until we return for it as husband and wife. Let the gossips chew on that." They left the cafe together, walking neither fast nor slow. 2 people approaching their fate with the measured pace of those who'd learned that running toward or away from destiny made little difference. The morning sun had burned off the station smoke, leaving the sky that impossible blue that made the mountains look painted against it. Judge Peterson indeed proved to be in his chambers, though his eyebrows climbed nearly to his hairline when they explained their business. The marriage license cost $2, which Elijah paid while Margaret signed her name in copperplate script that spoke of better days and educated hands. The judge's wife, summoned as witness, tittered about the lack of flowers and proper dress until Margaret's steady gaze silenced her. The ceremony itself took less than 5 minutes. They stood before the judge's desk, not touching except when required to exchange rings. Elijah pulled his watch chain from his vest pocket, working free a simple brass band worn smooth by years. "My mother's," he explained quietly. "She died when I was born. It's not much, but it's never been worn by anyone else." Margaret slipped it onto her finger where it fit, as if made for her. "It's perfect. I have nothing to give in return." "You're giving me your word. That's worth more than gold to someone who knows what broken promises cost." Judge Peterson cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the naked honesty of the exchange. He rushed through the remaining words, pronounced them married, and seemed relieved when they didn't attempt to kiss. The leather-bound registry recorded their names, the date, and nothing of the desperation and hope that had brought them to this moment. They emerged from the courthouse married, the sun somehow brighter, the mountains somehow closer. Margaret tucked her hand into the crook of Elijah's elbow, not from affection, but from the practical need to maintain balance on the wooden sidewalk's uneven boards. "Well, Mrs. Torrance," Elijah said, the name strange on his tongue. "Shall we collect your trunk and go home?" "Yes, Mr. Torrance," she replied, matching his formal tone. "I believe we shall." They returned to the station, where the sight of them together, Margaret now wearing a wedding band, caused a silence that rippled out like water from a thrown stone. The station master's mouth opened and closed without sound. Mrs. DeWitt dropped her parasol. The morning train, preparing to depart, seemed to hold its breath. Margaret and Elijah collected her trunk, loaded it onto his waiting mule, and began the long climb toward the mountains. Behind them, Copper Ridge exploded with gossip, but they were already too far away to hear it, walking steadily toward a future that promised nothing except the honest attempt to build something from the ruins of what they'd lost. The wedding ring caught the sunlight as Margaret helped steady the trunk, a small flash of hope against all reasonable odds. The mule, a creature of infinite patience named Moses, stood still as Elijah adjusted the pack saddle to accommodate Margaret's trunk. The process required engineering worthy of a bridge builder. Her worldly possessions needed to balance against 50 pounds of flour in cotton sacks, canned goods, coffee, and the coal oil that would see them through the darkening months ahead. Margaret stood aside, holding the canvas water bag and a small parcel of personal items she'd extracted from the trunk before it was sealed and roped. "I can walk," she said when Elijah gestured toward Moses's back. "The supplies are more important." "It's 8 miles and 3,000 feet up," he replied, testing the rope tension. "Those boots weren't made for mountain work." She glanced down at her side-button boots, the leather already showing scuff marks from the morning's activities. "They'll hold." "I've asked enough of you already without taking your mule's services, too." Behind them, Copper Ridge's residents had gathered in strategic positions to witness their departure. Mrs. DeWitt stood outside the mercantile with two other churchwomen, their conversation pitched just loud enough to carry. "Won't last the winter," Mrs. DeWitt proclaimed with the certainty of someone who'd never been wrong about anything, especially other people's failures. "Mark my words, she'll be back before the first snow, begging for charity. If she survives that long," her companion added. "You know what they say about Elijah Torrance? Man's been alone up there so long, he's more bear than human." Margaret's spine straightened at the words, but she didn't turn. Elijah noticed her hands tighten on the water bag, knuckles white against the canvas. He finished the last knot with deliberate slowness, then spoke loud enough for the gossips to hear. "Ready, wife?" The word wife fell strange from his lips, but it served its purpose. Margaret turned to him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes but showed steel in its edges. "Ready, husband." They left Copper Ridge with the morning sun climbing toward noon, Moses plodding between them with the steady gait of an animal that knew every stone of the coming trail. The town shrank behind them, its judgment and whispers fading into the larger silence of the mountains. The trail began gently enough, winding through stands of yellow pine and juniper, but soon tilted upward at an angle that made Margaret's breathing audible. An hour in, sweat had soaked through the back of her dress despite the October chill. Her steps grew shorter, more determined. Elijah watched her from the corner of his eye, seeing the way she placed each foot with care, how her hand occasionally pressed against her corset as if willing her lungs to expand beyond its constraints. "There's no shame in riding," he said. "There's no room for riding," she countered, which was true enough. Moses carried their future on his back. They climbed in silence, broken only by the mule's occasional snort and the cry of hawks circling the thermals. The trail switched back and forth across the mountain face, each turn revealing another stretch of ascent. Margaret's boots, designed for St. Louis sidewalks and church floors, began to split at the seams. He could see her wince with certain steps, but she said nothing. At a wider spot in the trail, where a fallen log offered natural seating, Elijah called a halt. "Moses needs water." It was a lie. Moses could have continued another 2 hours without complaint, but Margaret sank onto the log with barely concealed relief. Elijah unhitched the water bag, offering it to her first. She drank carefully, mindful of rationing, then passed it back. From his pocket, he produced dried apples wrapped in brown paper, the last of the previous year's harvest. "From your trees?" she asked, accepting 2 slices. "From trees near the claim. Won't call them mine. They were there before me. They'll be there after." He sat beside her, maintaining a careful foot of distance. "Though I've been tending them some, pruning, clearing the competing growth." "My mother had an apple tree," Margaret said, chewing slowly. "A single tree in the backyard, barely taller than the fence. She babied it through 7 years before it finally bore fruit. 3 apples, total. We ate them for Christmas dinner, sliced paper thin to make them last." She smiled at the memory. "Sweetest things I ever tasted." "What happened to the tree?" "Sold it with the house. New owners cut it down for firewood the first winter." She stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "Shall we continue?" They climbed through the afternoon, the trail growing rougher as they ascended. Elijah began pointing out plants along the way, partly to distract her from the difficulty, partly because the knowledge might prove necessary. "That's yarrow." He indicated a cluster of white flowers. "Stops bleeding better than bandages. The purple there is bee balm, makes tea that'll break a fever. And that," he pointed to a low-growing plant with serrated leaves, "that's what the Utes call bear medicine, good for chest complaints. You learned all this alone. Books, mostly, and trial and error. Amazing what you'll try when the nearest doctor is 2 days away." He paused. "Can you read?" She gave him a look that could have scorched paint. "I kept books for 3 businesses in St. Louis. I can read, write, and calculate figures in my head faster than most can on paper." I speak passable French and enough German to handle immigrant customers. She stepped over a root with exaggerated care. So, yes, Mr. Torrance, I can read. Didn't mean offense. Just, my last partner could barely sign his name. Made the betrayal harder when I realized he'd managed to forge my signature on the bank withdrawal. They were entering the harder portion of the climb now, where the trail narrowed and loose shale made each step treacherous. Margaret's exhaustion showed in the set of her shoulders, the way she used her hands to steady herself against the rock face. They were perhaps a mile from the cabin when it happened. Her left foot, seeking purchase on what looked like solid stone, found loose shale instead. The rocks scattered like marbles. Her ankle turned, and she pitched sideways toward the drop. Elijah moved without thinking, his hand closing around her upper arm, pulling her back against the solid mountain wall. They froze there, her back pressed against granite, his hand still gripping her arm, their faces inches apart. It was the first time they'd truly touched since their handshake at the altar. Through the fabric of her dress, he could feel her trembling, from fear or exhaustion or perhaps both. Her eyes, wide with the surprise of near disaster, met his. For a moment, neither moved. "Thank you," she whispered. He released her arm as if it burned, stepping back to give her room. Trail gets worse before it gets better. Stay close to the wall. They continued in silence, but something had shifted. Their awareness of each other had sharpened, like the air before a lightning strike. Margaret walked closer to him now, occasionally accepting his offered hand over the worst passages. The sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the mountainside gold and red. They crested the final rise just as the sun touched the horizon. The cabin sat in a small meadow, backed by a stand of towering pines, facing west toward the descended valley. It was smaller than Margaret had probably imagined. A single room with a lean-to addition. Stone chimney already releasing a thin stream of smoke from the banked fire Elijah had left that morning. But the walls stood straight and true. The roof appeared sound, and glass windows, a luxury at this elevation, caught the sunset like captured flame. "It's not much," Elijah began. "It's shelter that doesn't depend on anyone's charity or goodwill." Margaret interrupted. "That makes it palace enough." Moses knew they were home and picked up his pace, heading for the small corral where his shed promised hay and rest. As they followed, Margaret stumbled again, this time from pure exhaustion, without hesitation. Elijah offered his arm. She took it, her weight against him slight but trust evident in the gesture. "How did you manage this climb in those boots?" he asked, noting fresh blood seeping through the split leather. "The same way I managed everything else today," she replied. "One step at a time, trying not to think about how many more remained." They reached the cabin door as the last light faded from the sky. Elijah pushed it open, revealing the sparse interior. A rope bed with corn husk mattress, rough table, 2 chairs, shelves holding a few books and supplies. The fireplace with its banked coals still glowing. Miner's candlestick sat ready on the table, beside a box of matches. Margaret stood in the doorway, taking inventory of her new home. Elijah watched her face, trying to read her reaction. Was she calculating how far she'd fallen from whatever she'd imagined when James's letters had promised prosperity? Was she regretting the hasty marriage to a stranger who could offer nothing but this rough shelter? "It's clean," she finally said, stepping inside. "And solid? And ours?" She turned to him, and for the first time since he'd approached her at the station, her smile reached her eyes. "That's more than I had this morning." Elijah felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't realized was there. "I'll unload Moses, get your trunk inside. The creek's just behind those trees if you want to wash. There's a basin and pitcher by the bed." She nodded, moving toward the promised water with the careful steps of someone whose feet had paid dearly for the day's journey. At the door, Elijah paused, looking back. "Margaret." She turned, silhouetted against the dying fire's glow. "You did well today. The climb, the town, all of it. You did well. Her smile was tired, but genuine. So did you. Elijah. So did you. He went to tend Moses and bring in the supplies, leaving her to make what peace she could with their new life. Outside, the first stars appeared above the peaks, and somewhere in the pines. An owl called to its mate. The sound echoed across the meadow, a reminder that even in the wilderness, no one was truly meant to be alone. The question of sleeping arrangements hung in the air like smoke from the pine logs Elijah added to the fire. Margaret stood by her open trunk, removing items with careful deliberation. A brush, a small mirror, what appeared to be a nightgown folded within brown paper. Neither of them looked at the single rope bed with its corn husk mattress that dominated the corner of the cabin. You take the bed, Elijah said finally, pulling his bedroll from a peg on the wall. I've slept by fires more nights than I can count. The floor here's warmer and drier than most ground I've known. Margaret paused in her unpacking. That hardly seems fair. It's your home. Our home, he corrected, then cleared his throat at the implication. And it's only practical. You're exhausted from the climb. Your feet need proper rest to heal. Tomorrow will bring its own work. She nodded, accepting the logic, if not the charity. They moved around each other with the careful choreography of strangers learning to share space, each hyper-aware of the other's presence. When Margaret retreated behind the calico curtain he'd strung across the corner for privacy, Elijah busied himself with banking the fire and arranging his bedroll at a respectful distance from both the bed and the heat. The sounds of her preparing for sleep, the rustle of fabric, the splash of water in the basin, the soft groan as she sat on the bed to unwrap her damaged feet, seemed impossibly intimate in the small space. Elijah stared at the fire, giving her the only privacy available. When she finally spoke from behind the curtain, her voice was soft with exhaustion. Good night, Elijah. Good night, Margaret. He lay awake long after her breathing deepened into sleep, studying the roof beams in the firelight and wondering what manner of madness had possessed him that morning. Beside the hearth, her boots sat like wounded soldiers, the leather split and stained with blood. He'd need to find her better ones. Somehow. Add it to the list of things needed that he hadn't considered when proposing marriage to a stranger. Dawn came with frost on the windows and his back aching from the hard floor. He rose quietly, rebuilding the fire before stepping outside to the necessary. When he returned, Margaret was awake, sitting on the bed's edge with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, studying the cabin in the morning light. What she saw clearly disheartened her. Mouse droppings lined the shelves. Grease and soot blackened the area around the stove. Broken preserves jars had been swept into a corner but never removed. The windows, which had seemed charming at sunset, were nearly opaque with accumulated grime. I haven't been much for housekeeping, Elijah admitted. I can see that. She stood, wincing as her feet took her weight. Do you have lye vinegar rags that could be spared? Under the lean-to, mostly. Haven't made soap since last spring. Then that's where I'll start. She moved to her trunk, pulling out a plain day dress. After breakfast, I assume you have something beyond dried apples? Beans, salt pork, cornmeal for mush or Johnny cakes? Johnny cakes, then. She paused at the curtain. If you'll give me a moment. He stepped outside again, giving her privacy to dress. The morning air bit sharp and clean, the meadow grass silver with frost. Down at the claim, he could see where the sluice boxes waited, yesterday's work abandoned for the trip to town. He'd need to return to it today, but first. When Margaret emerged from the cabin, her hair pinned in a practical bun, sleeves already rolled to her elbows, she looked like a woman prepared for war. She'd found his apron, a canvas thing he used when butchering, and tied it around her waist. I'll need wood ash from the fireplace, the fat you've been saving, and whatever water you can spare, she said. The soap making can happen while you work your claim. But first, breakfast and lessons. Lessons. You'll teach me about the gold. I can't keep books on something I don't understand. They prepared breakfast together, moving around the small cooking space with increasing efficiency. Margaret's Johnny cakes proved superior to his usual efforts, though she frowned at the limited supplies. While they ate, Elijah explained the basics of placer mining, how gold, being heavier than other materials, settled in specific spots along the creek bed, how the sluice boxes used water flow and gravity to separate gold from gravel. "Show me," she said when he'd finished explaining. They walked to the claim, Margaret wearing his spare boots stuffed with rags to make them fit. The sluice boxes sat like wooden ladders in the creek, water flowing through them in a constant rush. Elijah demonstrated how to shovel gravel into the upper box, how the riffles caught the heavier gold while lighter material washed away. "And at day's end," she asked, "we collect the concentrates, pan them out for the fine gold." He showed her the circular motion with the pan, how to swirl water and sediment until only the heaviest particles remained. "Takes patience. Rush it and you lose gold. Too slow and you'll be here all night." Margaret took the pan, attempting to replicate his movements. Water sloshed over the edges, her motion too aggressive. "Like kneading dough," she murmured, adjusting her technique. "Firm but patient." "You've got it," he said, surprised at how quickly she adapted. They returned to the cabin, where Margaret began her assault on the accumulated neglect. Elijah worked the claim, the familiar rhythm of shovel and sluice a comfort after yesterday's upheaval. But his awareness kept pulling toward the cabin, where smoke from the outdoor fire indicated Margaret's soap-making progress. By noon, when he returned for dinner, the transformation had begun. The windows gleamed clear. The mouse droppings were gone. Fresh-made lye soap sat hardening on a board. She'd created a washing station from spare lumber and an old bucket, mounting it on a tree stump near the door. "You've been busy," he said. "Idle hands," she replied. But he caught her wince as she served beans and cornbread. Her feet, despite the borrowed boots, were suffering. "There's bear grease in a tin above the stove," he offered. "Good for waterproofing boots. Might help with the healing, too." "Thank you." She sat across from him, and they ate in companionable silence. Through the clean windows, sunlight streamed in, revealing dust motes dancing in the air and something else, a photograph tucked behind a beam near the bed. Margaret's eyes followed his gaze. She'd clearly found it while cleaning, but said nothing. The image was of Sarah, blonde, delicate, everything Margaret wasn't. After the meal, while Elijah prepared to return to the claim, Margaret quietly reached up and turned the photograph face down. The gesture was so simple, so without judgment, that it hit him harder than any confrontation could have. She wasn't demanding he forget or destroy it. She was simply suggesting that perhaps the past didn't need to watch over their present. That evening, after the day's gold had been panned and carefully stored in a leather pouch, after dinner had been eaten and dishes washed in the creek, they sat by the fire. Margaret had produced 3 books from her trunk, a Bible, McGuffey's Reader, and, surprisingly, a volume of Shakespeare's comedies. "You read Shakespeare?" Elijah asked. "My father did. Read aloud every Sunday after church. Said if we could understand Shakespeare, we could understand anything life threw at us." She opened the McGuffies. "But I thought this might be more useful. If I'm to keep the books, I need to practice my numbers. It's been months since I did real accounting." She produced a slate and chalk from her trunk, tools of her trade as much as his pan and shovel were his, while she worked columns of figures. Elijah found himself watching her in the firelight, the concentration on her face, the way she bit her lower lip when calculating, the satisfaction when the numbers balanced. All of it spoke to competence, to pride in skill. "What are you figuring?" he asked. "Your yield today versus expenses. If my calculations are correct, you cleared about $3 after accounting for wear on equipment and supplies used." "$3.40, he corrected. "You're not accounting for the mercury we'll need to replace next month for catching fine gold." She adjusted her figures, nodding. Then we need to average $4 a day to cover expenses and save for winter supplies. We, he repeated. The word still foreign but not unpleasant. We, she confirmed, meeting his eyes. Partners. Remember. Later, preparing for bed with the same careful dance as the night before. Elijah paused at the photograph Margaret had turned. Without comment, he took it down, walked to the fire, and dropped it into the flames. The image curled and blackened, Sarah's face disappearing into ash. "Thank you," Margaret said softly from behind the curtain. "For what?" "For choosing to let go." He spread his bedroll by the dying fire, his back already protesting the coming night on hard floor. But something in his chest felt lighter, as if burning the photograph had cremated more than just paper. Above him, the roof beams caught shadows and light in familiar patterns, but tonight they seemed less like prison bars and more like shelter freely chosen. "Elijah," Margaret's voice came soft in the darkness. "Yes. Tomorrow. I'd like to learn to pan for gold properly. And perhaps you could show me which mushrooms are safe to gather. We need more than beans and cornmeal if we're to make it through winter." "I can do that," he replied, then added, "You did well today, too. The cabin already feels different. Cleaner, you mean?" "No," he said after a pause. "Lived in, like a home instead of just a shelter." She didn't reply, but he heard her shift in the bed, perhaps turning toward the wall, perhaps toward him. It didn't matter. They had time to figure out the geometry of their new life. Time to learn whether partnership could grow into something more, or whether it would remain what they'd agreed upon, a practical arrangement between two people who'd learned to expect nothing but were willing to work for something. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like whispered promises. Inside, two strangers who'd married that morning began the slow work of becoming something else, not yet friends, certainly not lovers, but no longer quite so alone. The fire died to coals, the cabin settled into night sounds, and somewhere in the darkness between them, possibility took root like seeds in newly turned soil. 3 weeks had passed since the marriage, and they'd developed rhythms as precise as clockwork. Margaret rose first, stoking the fire while Elijah hauled water, breakfast together, then he to the claim, she to her expanding domestic empire, dinner at noon, supper at dusk, evenings by the fire with her books and his maintenance of tools. They spoke more now, but carefully, like people testing ice before trusting their full weight. The morning of the storm started with deceptive calm. October had aged into November, bringing shorter days and frost that lingered past noon. Elijah stood at the claim, watching the sky with growing unease. To the west, clouds piled like gray wool against the peaks. But it was the air itself that worried him, too warm for November, thick with the electric feeling that preceded violence. "Storm coming," he told Margaret at dinner. "Big one, by the feel." She looked up from the ledger where she'd been recording the week's yields. Snow. No. Rain. The kind that turns creeks into rivers and washes away everything not anchored deep. He pushed his beans around the plate, calculating. "I need to secure the sluice boxes, maybe move them entirely. How can I help?" "You can't. Stay here. Keep the fire going. I'll handle it." Margaret's spine straightened. A gesture he'd learned meant argument incoming. "I asked how I can help, not whether I could." "This isn't washing windows or making soap. The sluice boxes weigh more than you do. When wet, they're slippery as greased glass. And if the storm hits while we're down there, then you'll need every hand available." She closed the ledger with deliberate finality. "I'm not Sarah, Elijah. I don't need protecting from hard work or harsh weather. We're partners, or we're nothing." The comparison to Sarah stung, mostly because it was accurate. He'd been protecting Margaret the same way he'd once protected Sarah, who'd complained about calluses from churning butter. But Margaret's hands already bore the marks of lye soap and rough wood, and she'd never complained once. "There's oilcloth slickers in the lean-to," he said finally, "and India rubber boots that might fit if you stuff the toes." By the time they reached the claim, the wind had picked up, sending pine needles horizontal through the air. The creek, usually a cheerful babble, had grown louder, fed by rain already falling higher in the mountains. They worked without speaking, communication reduced to gestures and nods. Elijah showed Margaret how to use the block and tackle to lift the sluice boxes from the water. She caught on quickly, her bookkeeper's mind understanding the principles of leverage and mechanical advantage. They'd moved 2 of the 3 boxes to higher ground when the sky opened like a split seam. Rain didn't fall so much as collapse from the clouds, instant and overwhelming. Within seconds, they were soaked through despite the slickers. The creek's voice changed from babble to roar, water rising visibly with each minute. The last box, Elijah shouted over the storm. It was their best producer, positioned at a bend where gold naturally collected. But the rising water had already lifted it partially, threatening to tear it from its anchors. They splashed into the creek together, water now knee-deep and powerful enough to stagger them. Elijah grabbed one end while Margaret took the other. The box twisted in the current like a living thing trying to escape. That's when the upstream anchor gave way. The box swung violently toward Margaret. She didn't retreat but instead threw her weight backward, using the water's force to help pivot the box toward shore. It was exactly the right move, one that would have taken Elijah precious seconds to think through. Together they wrestled it to safety, but not before Margaret spotted something. "The concentrate bucket," she yelled. Their week's worth of gold-bearing sand, waiting to be panned, sat forgotten by the creek's edge. The rising water licked at its base. Margaret lunged for it just as a wave swept it into the current. For a terrifying moment, Elijah thought she'd be swept away too, but she managed to hook the bucket's handle while grabbing an exposed root with her other hand. "I've got it," she gasped as he pulled her back. They stumbled to the cabin as darkness fell, guided more by instinct than sight. The storm lantern's mica windows glowed like a lighthouse beacon through the rain. Inside, they stood dripping, too exhausted to move. Water pooled around their feet. Their clothes steamed in the fire's heat. Margaret looked at him, mud streaking her face. Her hair escaped from its pins and plastered to her head like a helmet. Her dress beneath the slicker was soaked through, clinging and filthy. She looked absolutely ridiculous. "You look like a drowned badger," she said. He caught his reflection in the window, hair standing in muddy spikes, face striped with dirt where rain had tracked through it, clothes so wet they seemed to have melted onto him. "You look like you've been wrestling pigs in a swamp," he countered. They stared at each other for a moment, then Margaret snorted. The sound was so unexpected, so unladylike, that Elijah barked out a laugh. Then they were both laughing, deep belly laughs that left them gasping. They laughed until they had to lean against the wall, until tears mixed with the rainwater on their faces, until their sides ached worse than their backs. It was the first moment of pure shared joy since they'd met. "We need to get out of these clothes," Margaret finally gasped, still giggling. "We'll catch our deaths." Propriety be damned. They hung a rope across the cabin and draped blankets for privacy. On her side, Margaret peeled off the soaked layers. On his, Elijah did the same. Wet clothes were hung anywhere they'd fit. Chairs, pegs, even the rifle rack. The cabin looked like a very poor laundry. "There's elderberry wine in the high shelf," Elijah called over the blanket. "Medicinal purposes." "Medicinal," Margaret agreed, her teeth chattering. "Absolutely medicinal." They sat by the fire wrapped in blankets, passing the bottle between them. The wine was sweet and strong, made by a widow in town who swore by its healing properties. Whether medicine or not, it warmed them from the inside while the fire worked from the outside. "That move with the sluice box," Elijah said after the second pass of the bottle. "Using the water's force instead of fighting it, that was smart." "Physics," Margaret replied. "Same principle as double-entry bookkeeping. Every force has an equal and opposite reaction. You just have to figure out how to make them balance in your favor. You could have been swept away grabbing that bucket, but I wasn't. And we kept our gold." She accepted the bottle, took a careful sip. "How much would we have lost?" $40, maybe 50. Then it was worth the risk. She pulled her blanket tighter. You said I looked like a drowned badger. You said I looked like I'd been wrestling pigs. We were both right. She smiled, and this time it transformed her whole face. Not beautiful in the classical sense, but something better. Real, warm, alive. When I was young, my father took me to see a traveling theater. There was a comedy where two pompous aristocrats fell into a pond while arguing about who was more dignified. They emerged covered in pond weed, still arguing even as the audience howled with laughter. She paused. I never understood why it was so funny until tonight. Because dignity's just another word for distance, Elijah said, the wine loosening his tongue. And it's hard to maintain distance when you're both covered in mud. They sat quietly, listening to the storm rage outside. The cabin creaked but held firm, its logs and chinking proof against wind and water. Safe, warm, dry. After the last hour, these simple things felt like miracles. My father tried to ranch, Elijah said suddenly, surprising himself. He'd never told anyone this story, not even Sarah. Down in Texas, before the war, had 300 head of longhorns, good land, water rights, did everything right, worked 18-hour days, never drank, never gambled. What happened? Drought? 3 years running? Wells went dry. Grass turned to dust. Cattle started dying. He sold them for pennies on the dollar to anyone who could move them to water. Lost everything. The shame killed him faster than the failure. Heart gave out 2 months after the bank took the land. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Is that why you chose gold, because it doesn't need rain? Chose gold because it's honest. It's either there or it's not. No promises, no maybes, no next year will be better. Just rock and water and what you can pull from them with your own hands. And yet you took a chance on me. That's not gold in a pan. Elijah, that's a very uncertain investment. He looked at her across the fire. Her hair was drying into wild curls, her face pink from wine and heat. The blanket had slipped from one shoulder, revealing the plain cotton of her shift. Not beautiful, not delicate, not what he'd thought he wanted, but real, solid, present in a way Sarah had never been. Best gamble I've made in years, he said quietly. She held his gaze for a moment, then rose, wrapping the blanket around herself like a toga. I'm going to attempt to find something dry to sleep in. Don't peek. Wouldn't dream of it, he lied, then made himself busy banking the fire while she changed. Later, lying in their respective beds, she in the rope bed, he on his floor pallet, the storm continued its assault on the mountain. But inside, something had shifted. The laughter, the shared work, the wine-loosened confessions had worn down walls neither had realized they'd built. Elijah, Margaret's voice came through the darkness. Yes. Thank you for letting me help today, for treating me like a real partner. Thank you for being one. That move with the bucket, I'd have let it go, written off the loss. You saved us $50 with quick thinking and brave action. Desperate action. More like, but I'll take the compliment. A pause. The storm's getting worse. It was. The wind howled like something alive and angry. Thunder rolled boulder-like across the peaks. Lightning illuminated the cabin in snapshot moments. The cabin will hold, he assured her. Built it myself, and I overbuilt everything. Too much time alone makes a man paranoid about walls falling in. I wasn't worried about the cabin. What then? I was thinking, your bedroll is soaked through. The floor must be freezing. There's room up here, if you stayed on your side, just for warmth, just for tonight. Elijah's heart hammered louder than the thunder. It was practical, sensible even. Their clothes were wet. The night was cold. Shared body heat was simple survival logic, but they both knew it was more than that. Just for warmth, he agreed, gathering his one dry blanket. He climbed into the bed carefully, fully clothed, staying so close to the edge he was in danger of falling off. Margaret stayed pressed against the wall. Between them, a careful foot of space that felt like a chasm and a hair's breadth simultaneously. "Good night, Elijah. Good night, Margaret." Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the cabin, two people lay awake in the darkness, aware of every breath, every shift, every heartbeat. They'd crossed a line tonight, not the physical boundary of the bed, but something more fundamental. They'd chosen to trust, to laugh, to share. They'd moved from partners by contract to partners by choice, though neither would have words for it until much later. The storm would pass by morning, leaving the world washed clean and somehow newer. But the change it had wrought inside the cabin would last much longer, the first real foundation of what would, given time and courage, become love. The supply rider came once a month, weather permitting, bringing mail and goods ordered from town. 2 weeks had passed since the storm, 2 weeks of careful progress. Elijah and Margaret had returned to sleeping separately, but something fundamental had shifted. They worked side by side at the claim now, talked easier over meals, even smiled at shared jokes. The partnership was becoming something neither had expected, comfortable, which made the letter's arrival feel like a rattlesnake in Eden. The rider, a taciturn man named Carl, handed Margaret the envelope with obvious reluctance. "From St. Louis," he said unnecessarily, the postmark clear as accusation. Margaret's face went pale, then flushed. Recognizing the handwriting, "My sister," she said quietly, fingering the wax seal. Elijah continued checking the supplies, salt, coffee, the precious panes of glass to repair the window cracked in the storm. But he watched Margaret from the corner of his eye as she broke the seal and unfolded the pages. 3 sheets, covered in dense script. Her sister had much to say, apparently. As she read, Margaret's expression cycled through surprise, hurt, and finally a blankness that worried him more than tears would have. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her apron pocket, and turned to help unload supplies. But her hands shook as she lifted the flour sacks. "Bad news," Elijah ventured. "My sister's opinion of my choices. Nothing unexpected." Her voice was steady, controlled, too controlled. They worked in silence, storing goods in the lean-to and cabin. Carl departed with a list for next month and 2 letters Elijah had written about claim business. As his horse disappeared down the trail, Margaret walked to the meadow's edge and stood looking toward the valley, letter clutched in her hand. Elijah gave her space, returning to the claim though concentration proved impossible. When she didn't appear for the noon meal, he went looking. He found her by the creek, sitting on a boulder, the letter in pieces at her feet. She'd been crying. The evidence was there in her reddened eyes, the handkerchief twisted in her hands, but it was the defeated slope of her shoulders that struck him hardest. She looked exactly as she had that morning at the station, abandoned and alone. "She calls me shameful," Margaret said without preamble. "Says I've degraded myself and the family name by marrying a mountain hermit, that I'm no better than those women who sell themselves in mining camps." She laughed bitterly. She actually used the word harlot. "My own sister." Elijah felt anger rise hot in his throat. "She doesn't know anything about our arrangement." "No, she doesn't. But she knows I married a stranger the same day James abandoned me. In her world. That's enough to condemn me." Margaret picked up a piece of the letter, read aloud. "Your desperation has made you pathetic. Margaret, at least when you were merely a spinster, you maintained some dignity. Now you're just another mining camp tragedy waiting to happen." The words hit Elijah like cold water. Mining camp tragedy. Is that what they were? What he'd made her into? He thought of Sarah's letter when she'd left, full of similar accusations, that he'd dragged her down, limited her possibilities, trapped her in a life beneath her station. "Maybe she's right," he said quietly. Margaret's head snapped up. "What? You could have done better, should have done better. I took advantage of your desperation, offered you a life of labor when you deserved." "Stop." Margaret stood, anger replacing hurt. Don't you dare decide what I deserve. That's my choice, not yours, not my sister's, not anyone's but mine. But Elijah was already retreating into the familiar fortress of self-protection. History was repeating, the letter, the condemnation from family, the slow poison of doubt. Soon Margaret would see what Sarah had seen, what Thomas had seen, that he was meant to be alone, that anyone who tied themselves to him would eventually cut free. I need to check the upper claim, he said, though they both knew he'd checked it yesterday. He left her there by the creek and climbed higher into the mountains, to a played-out section he sometimes panned when he needed to think. The work was pointless, barely dust in the pan, but the rhythm helped. Scoop, swirl, check, scoop, swirl, check. Mechanical, predictable, safe. He didn't return until after dark. Margaret had left dinner on the table, beans and cornbread kept warm by the banked fire, but she was already behind the curtain, in bed, or pretending to be. Elijah ate in silence, then spread his bedroll as far from her corner as the cabin allowed. The second day was worse. They moved around each other like ghosts, present but not touching, not speaking beyond necessity. More coffee. No thank you. I'll be at the claim. I'll be washing. Sentences pruned to stems. Nothing that might bloom into actual conversation. Margaret threw herself into domestic work with frightening intensity. She scrubbed clothes that were already clean, reorganized shelves that didn't need organizing, mended things that weren't quite broken yet. Elijah recognized the behavior. She was preparing. Getting everything in order for when she left. Making sure the cabin would function without her. Just as Sarah had done. That night, Elijah found her trunk partially packed, though she'd tried to hide it with a blanket. The sight of her folded dresses, her books carefully wrapped, hit him with a pain that bent him double. He stumbled outside, claiming he needed to check on Moses, and stood in the cold darkness fighting the urge to howl at the indifferent stars. The third day, Margaret's eyes were red-rimmed, though she hadn't cried where he could see. She moved through her routines mechanically, efficiently, like someone already half gone. Elijah worked the claim with vicious determination, punishing rocks that had done nothing wrong, finding no gold and caring less. That evening, as he sat by the fire pretending to repair a harness that needed no repair, Margaret emerged from behind the curtain. She stood in front of him, hands flat on the table, and when he wouldn't look up, she slammed both palms down hard enough to make the dishes jump. Enough. He looked up, startled by the violence from someone so controlled. 3 days. Elijah. 3 days you've been pulling away, building walls, preparing for me to leave, all because of one cruel letter from someone who doesn't know us, doesn't know this life, doesn't know anything beyond her own narrow world. It's not just the letter. No, it's not. It's Sarah. It's Thomas. It's everyone who ever left you believing you're meant to be alone. And now you're so convinced I'll leave that you're pushing me away first. She pulled a small coffee tin from her apron, slammed it on the table between them. You want to know what this is? He recognized it. He'd seen her hide it behind the flour bin. Had assumed it was women's things he shouldn't ask about. My escape money, she said flatly. $43 I've been saving from the household funds. My insurance policy. My way out if this went bad. She opened the tin, showed him the carefully folded bills and coins. I started it the first week. Added to it every time we went to town. Every time you gave me money for supplies, and I found ways to spend less. Elijah felt something die in his chest. So you have been planning to leave? Had been. Past tense. I stopped adding to it after the storm. Want to know why? She didn't wait for his answer. Because that night, laughing with you, working beside you, I realized something. I'm not her, Elijah, and you're not him. We chose each other with eyes wide open, knowing the worst that could happen because it already had. She picked up the tin, walked to the fire, and threw the entire contents into the flames. The bills caught immediately, curling into black butterflies. The coins fell into the coals, too hot to retrieve. There. Now I can't leave. Does that make you feel better? Don't, Elijah said, dropping to his knees by the fire, reaching for the poker to try to save something. Anything. That's your freedom. No. Margaret grabbed his wrist, pulled him back. That was my fear. Just like that photograph of Sarah was yours. Just like my sister's letter. Just like whatever letters you're keeping from Thomas or Sarah or whoever else made you believe you deserved to be alone. She was right. In the bottom of his trunk, wrapped in oilcloth, he kept them all. Sarah's goodbye, Thomas's justification for the betrayal, even his father's last letter before the heart attack, full of disappointment and resignation. He'd kept them like hair shirts, reminders of his failures, proof that trusting meant bleeding. Get them, Margaret said quietly. Whatever you're keeping, get them. He retrieved the packet, hands shaking slightly. Margaret had reassembled her sister's letter from the pieces by the creek, smoothing them flat. They stood together by the fire, holding their respective poisons. On 3, she suggested. On 3. They counted together, then cast the papers into the flames. Sarah's flowing script, Thomas's blocky letters, his father's shaky hand, Margaret's sister's precise condemnation, all of it turned to smoke and ash, rising up the chimney and dispersing into the night. Margaret turned to him, tears running freely now. I'm terrified. Elijah, every day I wake up expecting you to realize you made a mistake. Every night I go to bed wondering if tomorrow you'll ask me to leave, but I'm more terrified of living the rest of my life protecting myself from the possibility of hurt. I check your trunk, he admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep. Every day while you're working. I check to see if you're packing. When I saw it partially packed yesterday, I thought it was happening again. I was looking for warmer stockings. Winter's coming. They stood facing each other, the fire between them. Two people stripped of pretense and protection. Elijah saw his own fear reflected in Margaret's eyes, but also something else, determination, the same steel that had made her grab that gold bucket in the storm. I don't know how to trust, he said. I want to, but I don't know how anymore. Neither do I. She walked around the table, stood close enough that he could see the tear tracks on her cheeks. But maybe we can learn together, slowly, carefully, with the understanding that we're both terrified and doing it anyway. She held out her hand, the same businesslike gesture from the cafe that first morning. Partners. He took her hand, but instead of shaking it, he held it. Her fingers were rough from lie, strong from work, real in a way Sarah's delicate hands had never been. Partners, he agreed. Then, softer. Margaret, I'm sorry. For pulling away. For letting fear speak louder than what we've been building here. I'm sorry too. For keeping the escape fund. For not telling you about my sister's previous letters. This wasn't the first. Just the cruelest. They stood there, hands clasped, the weight of burned letters and burned money and burned bridges settling around them like ash. Finally, Margaret squeezed his hand and let go. I'm going to make tea, she said. Real tea. From the supply order. And we're going to sit by the fire and you're going to tell me about Thomas and Sarah and your father. And I'm going to tell you about James and my sister and why I really came west. And we're going to stop pretending our pasts don't matter just because we've decided to burn the evidence. That sounds... Elijah paused, searching for the word. Painful. Yes, but necessary. Like setting a broken bone. It hurts worse before it heals right. They spent the night talking, really talking, for the first time since their marriage. Not the careful conversations of strangers or the practical discussions of partners, but the messy, complicated sharing of two people deciding to know each other fully. By dawn, Hoarse from talking and raw from revelations, they'd reached a different place. Not love, not yet, but something that might grow into it if tended carefully. The escape fund was gone. The letters were ash. But in their place was something neither had expected, the fragile, tentative beginning of actual trust. It would take time to grow strong, would need protection from the storms, both internal and external, that would surely come. But it was there, small as a nugget in a pan full of sand. But just as real, just as valuable. "We should sleep," Margaret finally said as the first light touched the windows. "You need to work the claim today." "We need to work the claim," he corrected. "Together." She smiled, tired but genuine. "Together." Then they parted to their respective beds, but the distance felt different now. Not a chasm of mistrust, but simply space. Temporary and bridgeable. Outside, the morning birds began their chorus, and somewhere in the pines, life continued its ancient patterns of survival and hope. The December cold had settled into the mountains like a permanent resident, frost painting the windows each morning with intricate patterns that Margaret admired while heating water for coffee. 3 weeks had passed since they'd burned their letters. 3 weeks of careful honesty and growing closeness. They worked the claim together now, even in the bitter cold, and their evening conversations had evolved from careful to comfortable, which is why Elijah hadn't been looking for secrets when he found one. He'd been reaching for the good hammer, the one he kept in the storage box under the bed for detailed work. Margaret had gone to the creek for water, leaving him alone in the cabin. His hand brushed something that shouldn't have been there, smooth metal where there should only be rough wood. He pulled out a small tin, different from the one she'd burned, hidden behind a loose board he hadn't even known was loose. Inside, $27 in coins and bills, wrapped in a piece of paper with her careful handwriting, "In case." Just those 2 words, "in case." Elijah sat on the bed, tin in his hands, feeling something crack in his chest. After everything, after burning the letters, after their night of truth-telling, after weeks of working side by side, she still kept an escape route. He understood it, even respected the wisdom of it, but understanding didn't stop the hurt. He heard her footsteps approaching, quickly returned the tin to its hiding place, and was standing by the fire when she entered with the water bucket. "Creek's starting to freeze at the edges," she said, not noticing his stillness. "We'll need to cut through soon." "I'll handle it," he said automatically. She looked at him sharply. They'd moved past his reflexive protection, his assumption she couldn't handle the harder tasks. "We'll handle it," she corrected, but studied his face. "Are you well?" "Fine. I need to go to town tomorrow. Some business at the land office. I'll come with you." "No need. Just paperwork. Boring stuff." She frowned but didn't argue. They'd learned to give each other space when needed, though usually they explained why. This time, Elijah couldn't explain without revealing what he'd found, and he needed time to think. He left at dawn, but not for town. Instead, he climbed to a stand of dead pine he'd been meaning to harvest, selected a good piece, and began to work. He had his father's wood-burning tools, hadn't touched them since the ranch failed, but his hands remembered the movements. As he worked, he thought about Margaret, about trust, about the difference between keeping secrets and keeping safety. She'd burned $43 in front of him, but kept $27 hidden. It wasn't betrayal, not really. It was the behavior of someone who'd learned that sometimes the earth disappeared beneath your feet without warning. He thought of his own preparations, the gold he kept buried beneath the corner post, the spare rifle hidden in the lean-to, the month of food cached up the mountain. Everyone who'd been broken kept something in reserve, a last defense against total destruction. He worked through the day, stopping only when his hands cramped too badly to continue. The next morning, he actually did go to town, leaving before Margaret woke. The land office clerk, a young man named Peterson Jr., looked surprised by his request. "You want to add someone to your claim?" "My wife. Full partnership. Equal rights." "That's unusual. Most men keep the claim in their name only. Legal protection. You understand?" "I understand plenty. Elijah said. Draw up the papers. It cost $12 to file the amendment, another $3 for the official copy. At the mercantile, he spent more. Good leather boots in what he hoped was Margaret's size. A mohair shawl the color of forest shadows. New wool stockings. A pair of lined leather gloves. The final stop was the blacksmith, where he'd commissioned something weeks ago, paying in gold dust. Finished it yesterday, the smith said, producing a simple band of Colorado gold. Melted down from your own claim, like you asked. Nothing fancy, but it'll last. It's perfect. He returned home near sunset on the second day to find Margaret frantic with worry. She flew out of the cabin when she heard Moses's hooves, stopping short when she saw his face. I thought, when you didn't come back last night, I thought you'd left, that you'd decided. I'm never leaving, he said simply, dismounting. But I needed to prepare something. The third day, he put it all together. While Margaret tended the fire and prepared breakfast, he arranged everything in the wooden chest he'd made. The boots at the bottom, the shawl folded carefully, the gloves and stockings, the deed amendment in its official envelope, the gold band in a small leather pouch, on the lid's underside, burned deep into the wood, her initials, M.E.T. Margaret Eleanor Torrance. I need to show you something, he said when she brought him coffee. She followed him outside, where frost made the meadow grass crunch beneath their feet. The morning sun hadn't yet crested the peaks, leaving them in that blue shadow that comes before true dawn. He'd placed the chest on a flat stone near the fire pit they used for outdoor cooking. What is this? She asked, running her fingers over the carved initials. Open it. She lifted the lid, saw the boots first. Oh, Elijah, these are too fine, too expensive. Keep looking. She found the shawl, gasped at its softness, the gloves, the stockings, each item lifted with reverent care. Then the envelope. She opened it, read the document once, then again, her hands beginning to shake. You're giving me half the claim. Not giving, recognizing. You've earned it 10 times over. It's yours by right of work and partnership. She was crying now, silent tears that caught the first rays of sun breaking over the mountain. She reached for the last item, the small pouch, and poured the ring into her palm. It caught the light like captured fire, simple and perfect and real. That's when Elijah dropped to one knee in the frost, taking her free hand in both of his. The cold bit through his pants, but he didn't care. This moment had been coming for weeks. Maybe since that first day at the station. Certainly since the night of the storm. Margaret Eleanor Fletcher Torrance, he began, his voice rough with emotion. I married a stranger out of loneliness and desperation. We made a business arrangement, practical and safe. But somewhere between that first morning and now, between the storms and the silence, the work and the laughter, I fell in love with you. Not the idea of you, not the convenience of you, but you. The woman who grabs gold buckets from floodwater, who burns escape funds to make a point, who keeps emergency money because she's wise enough to know that love doesn't mean throwing away all caution. Margaret's eyes widened. You found it. 3 days ago, and instead of being angry, I was sad. Sad that you still needed that insurance. But then I realized, I've got gold buried under the corner post, 3 rifles hidden various places, food cached up the mountain. We both keep escape routes because we know what it costs when you need one and don't have it. Elijah, let me finish. Please. He steadied himself. I'm not asking you to throw away your emergency fund. Keep it. Add to it if you need. I'm not asking you to trust me completely. Trust like that has to be earned over years, not weeks. I'm asking you to stay, to choose this life not because you're trapped or desperate, but because you want it. I'm asking the woman I love to take this ring, to be my wife not just in law but in truth, to build something real with me, something neither of us has to run from." Margaret looked at the ring, at the chest of gifts, at the deed that made her a true partner. Then she looked at him, still kneeling in the frost. This man who'd seen her hidden fund and responded not with anger, but with understanding. "I stopped planning to leave the night of the storm," she said softly. "When we laughed ourselves sick, when we worked together, when you let me be your partner instead of your burden. I kept the fund not because I planned to use it, but because having it meant I was choosing to stay, not forced to. Does that make sense? Perfect sense?" She pulled him to his feet, her hands warm against his cold ones. "Yes, Elijah, yes to all of it. To the ring, to the partnership, to the life we're building. Yes to being your wife in truth, not just in law." He slipped the gold band onto her finger, above the brass one. 2 circles of commitment. One of desperation, one of choice. Then he kissed her. Their first real kiss. There in the frost with the sun painting the mountains gold and their breath making clouds in the cold air. "The boots might not fit," he said when they finally parted. "They'll fit." She was crying and laughing simultaneously. "And if they don't, I'll make them fit. I'm good at that now. Making things work that shouldn't. Finding hope in impossible places." They gathered the chest and went inside, where the fire had burned low. Margaret added wood while Elijah made fresh coffee, moving around each other with the ease of long practice, but also something new, an awareness that was warm rather than wary, anticipation rather than anxiety. "I want to tell you something," Margaret said, sitting at the table with her coffee, the new ring catching the firelight. "About James. About why I really answered his advertisement. You don't have to. I want to. No more secrets. Remember." She took a breath. "I was dying in St. Louis. Not dramatically, not physically, but dying all the same. Each day smaller than the last. Each year fewer possibilities. When James's letter came, I didn't love him. I barely knew him. But he offered escape from a life that was slowly suffocating me. I took it not for love, but for air, and found neither. No, I found both, just not where I expected." She reached across the table, took his hand. "I found them here, with you, in a place that should have been exile but became home. I found a man who sees me not as something to be protected or possessed, but as someone to work beside. That's worth more than all the promises James made, all the comfort my sister values." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, the morning growing brighter around them. Finally, Margaret stood, walked to her hiding place, and retrieved the tin with her emergency fund. She placed it on the table between them. "This stays," she said, "but not hidden. We both know it's there. We both know why. And if the day comes when neither of us needs that final safety net, we'll know we've truly won." "Agreed," Elijah said, "though I'd like to add to it. Make it our emergency fund, not just yours." "Ours," she repeated, the word carrying new weight. "I like that." They spent the morning trying on her new boots. They fit perfectly, admiring the chest he'd carved, reading and rereading the deed amendment that made her a legal partner in everything they'd built. The afternoon found them at the claim, working side by side as usual, but with a new ease, a settled quality that hadn't been there before. That night, as they prepared for bed, Margaret surprised him. "The floor must be miserable in this cold." "I've managed." That wasn't an observation. It was an invitation. She pulled back the covers on the bed, moved deliberately to the far side. "Husbands and wives share beds. Elijah, real ones do. Anyway." He stood frozen, uncertain despite everything that had passed between them. She smiled, understanding his hesitation. "I'm not Sarah. You're not James. We're us. and we get to decide what that means. Tonight, it means sharing warmth and sleeping without loneliness. Tomorrow we'll see. He climbed into bed carefully, still fully clothed as was she, but this time the space between them was invitation rather than barrier. Slowly, carefully, she moved closer until her back rested against his chest. His arm circled her waist. They fit together like puzzle pieces that had been cut from the same wood, shaped by similar storms. "I love you too," she whispered into the darkness. "I forgot to say it earlier, but I do. I love you, Elijah Torrance. Not because you saved me or provided for me, but because you see me as I am and choose me anyway." He pressed his face into her hair, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and the lavender soap she'd made last week. Outside, winter winds sang through the pines, promising snow by morning. Inside, two people who'd started as strangers held each other against the cold and the past and the fear, choosing love not as escape but as destination. The emergency fund sat on the table, no longer hidden but acknowledged. $27 that represented both fear and wisdom, past hurt and future hope. Above it on the shelf, the wooden chest with me-T, carved deep, holding gifts chosen with care and love. On Margaret's finger, 2 rings, brass and gold. Then and now, desperation and choice. They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other and in the life they were building one careful day at a time. No longer refugees from failed love, but architects of something new and strong and entirely their own. 6 months had transformed more than just the seasons. As Elijah helped Margaret down from the wagon, a new purchase made possible by a particularly rich strike in March, he noticed how the townspeople stared, not with the pity and mockery of last October, but with something approaching bewilderment. Margaret's pregnancy showed despite the clever draping of her dress, the special corset she'd ordered from the Sears catalog doing little to hide what was becoming obvious. But it wasn't just her condition that drew stares. It was the way they moved together, the unconscious coordination of married people who'd found their rhythm. "Steady," Elijah murmured, his hand at her elbow as they navigated the raised sidewalk. "I'm pregnant, not invalid," Margaret replied, but she leaned into his support anyway, her free hand resting protectively over the swell where their child grew. The late May sun was warm on their faces as they made their way to the mercantile. Behind them, Moses waited patiently in his traces, no longer bearing the lonely burden of a single man's supplies, but part of a fuller life that required a proper wagon, plans for expansion, dreams that extended beyond mere survival. Inside the mercantile, Mrs. DeWitt nearly dropped the bolt of calico she was examining. "Margaret, my word, that is to say, expecting?" Margaret supplied calmly. "Yes, Dr. Morrison in Silver Creek confirmed it last month, due in September. He thinks." The woman's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. This was the same creature she'd declared wouldn't last the winter. Yet here stood Margaret, obviously thriving, wearing a gold wedding band alongside the brass one, her husband's hand gentle at her back. "We'll need 10 pounds of sugar," Margaret told the clerk, ignoring Mrs. DeWitt's scrutiny. 20 of flour, the good white kind, coffee, of course. And do you have peppermint sticks? I've had the strangest craving for them." Elijah smiled at that. The cravings had started a month ago. Peppermint, pickled eggs, fresh bread at midnight. He'd gladly ride to town weekly if needed to satisfy them. He'd never seen Margaret so vibrant, so fully alive. The morning sickness had passed, leaving her with energy that she channeled into ambitious plans for the cabin, the claim, their future. While Margaret handled the ordering, consulting her detailed list, Elijah stepped outside for air. The station was visible from the mercantile's porch, and something about the scene there made him pause. A crowd had gathered, their posture and energy familiar in the worst way. He'd seen that same cruel anticipation 6 months ago when Margaret had sat on her trunk, abandoned and alone. He walked closer, pushing through the onlookers, and found exactly what he'd feared. A young woman, barely 20 if that, sat on a carpet bag near the baggage car. tears streaming down her face. Her dress, though wrinkled from travel, was well made. Her hands, clutching a telegram, shook visibly. The station master, Carl Henderson, was holding court as he had with Margaret. Came all the way from Denver. Fellow took one look and said she'd misrepresented herself. Got back on the train before it even finished taking on water. Third one this year. Elijah returned quickly to the mercantile. Found Margaret examining canned peaches. "You need to come with me," he said quietly. She read his face. Set down the can immediately. "What is it?" "The station. There's a girl." Understanding dawned in Margaret's eyes. They paid quickly for what they'd already selected, asked the clerk to hold the rest, and walked to the station together. The crowd parted for them, perhaps recognizing something determined in their approach. Margaret didn't hesitate. She walked directly to the crying girl, pulled out her handkerchief, the same one Elijah had given her that October morning, and offered it without a word. The girl looked up, confused by the kindness. She was pretty in a delicate way, with auburn hair and green eyes swollen from crying. "Thank you," she whispered. "Hungry?" Margaret asked, her voice gentle but firm. "The cafe's still serving breakfast. And after that, we need to talk about choices." The girl stared at Margaret, then at Elijah, clearly confused. I don't... Who are you?" "Someone who sat exactly where you're sitting 6 months ago," Margaret replied. "Same trunk, same tears, same crowd of vultures feeding on misery." She shot a look at the gathered townspeople that could have curdled milk. "The difference is, I was lucky. Someone offered me a hand up instead of entertainment." She helped the girl to her feet, and Elijah noticed how Margaret's pregnancy changed the dynamic. Here was proof that Margaret hadn't just survived her abandonment, but had thrived, found love, created life. The girl clung to that evidence like a lifeline. "What's your name?" Margaret asked as they walked toward the cafe. Rose McKenna." "Well, Rose, I'm Margaret Torrance, and this is my husband Elijah. 6 months ago, I was Margaret Fletcher, abandoned bride, public embarrassment, and owner of exactly 47 cents. She guided Rose to the same corner table where Elijah had proposed. "Today I'm part owner of a producing gold claim, a wife by choice rather than desperation, and about to become a mother. The difference between then and now was someone seeing me as a person rather than a spectacle." Molly Henderson brought coffee without being asked, giving Rose the same non-judgmental service she'd given Margaret. As the girl ate, she was clearly famished. Her story emerged. A correspondence courtship, promises of a business partnership, the sale of everything to afford the journey. "He said I was too young," Rose whispered, "that my letters had made me seem more mature. But I never lied. I swear I didn't. I'm 22. I told him that from the start." "Men who abandon women at train stations rarely need real reasons," Elijah said. "They're looking for excuses to justify decisions they'd already made." Margaret studied Rose carefully. "Can you read and write?" "Yes, ma'am. I taught school in Denver for 2 years. Can you handle rough living, hard work isolation?" "I grew up on a failed farm in Nebraska. I know hard." Margaret looked at Elijah. A full conversation in that glance. They'd been discussing hiring help, especially with the baby coming. The claim was producing well enough to support it, and the cabin needed expansion. "We have a proposition," Margaret said. "We need help at our claim. It's 8 miles up the mountain, rough living but fair treatment. Room, board, and wages. Through the winter at least. Longer if it suits all parties." Rose's eyes widened. "You're offering me work, but you don't know me." "I know you're brave enough to come west alone. Strong enough to sit here with dignity while being publicly humiliated. Practical enough to eat when offered food despite heartbreak." Margaret smiled. That's more than Elijah knew about me when he proposed marriage 3 hours after we met. Rose nearly choked on her coffee. He what? Proposed. In this very cafe. I said yes. We married that afternoon, and it's been the best impulsive decision either of us ever made. Margaret's hand found Elijah's across the table. Though I'm not suggesting that solution for you, just honest work and a chance to catch your breath while deciding what comes next. Why? Rose asked. Why would you help me? Margaret was quiet for a moment. Because someone should have. Because cruelty doesn't have to be the only response to vulnerability. Because we have the means to help and no good reason not to. She paused. And because I remember what it felt like to sit on that platform believing the world had ended, only to discover it was actually beginning. They waited while Rose made her decision, though Elijah suspected Margaret had already read the answer in the girl's straightening spine. Yes, Rose said. Yes, please. I'll work hard. I promise. The trip back up the mountain with 3 people and a wagon full of supplies took longer than usual. Rose sat in the back, cushioned by sacks of flour, taking in the scenery with the wide eyes of someone raised in flat country. Margaret pointed out landmarks, explained about the plants Elijah had taught her, prepared the girl for what she'd find at the cabin. It's not fancy, Margaret warned. 1 room, though Elijah's building an addition for the baby. You'll have a corner with a curtain for privacy. The work is real, cooking, washing, helping with the claim when needed. It sounds like heaven, Rose said softly, a place where the work means something. They arrived at sunset, the cabin golden in the late light. The addition Elijah had been working on was clearly visible, framed but not yet fully enclosed. Rose stood in the meadow, turning slowly to take in the mountains, the trees, the sense of shelter and peace. That evening, as they sat around the table Elijah had built to seat 4 in anticipation of needing help, Margaret served the stew she'd left simmering that morning. Rose had already proven helpful, organizing supplies without being asked, finding her way around the kitchen with easy efficiency. I should tell you, Rose said suddenly, I have $30 hidden in my bag, emergency money. I know that might make you think less of me, but... Margaret laughed, really laughed. Oh, Rose, let me show you something. She retrieved the tin from its place on the shelf, opened it to show the accumulated emergency fund, now nearly $60. We all keep insurance. It's not lack of trust. It's wisdom earned the hard way. After Rose had retired to her corner, exhausted from travel and emotion, Elijah and Margaret sat by the fire. Margaret was sketching on brown paper, working out plans for the nursery, a cradle here, a small wardrobe there, a rocking chair by the window. You did a good thing today, Elijah said softly. We did a good thing, she corrected. You saw her first, went against your hermit nature to help. My hermit nature died the day I met you. Margaret smiled, adding another detail to her sketch. The baby moved, a flutter she was just learning to recognize, and she placed Elijah's hand where he could feel it too. The station master found me when we were loading the wagon, Elijah said. Carl Henderson said he'd bet against us lasting the winter. Wanted to know what our secret was. What did you tell him? The truth, that we didn't have any secrets. Just 2 people who'd learned the hard way that pretty promises mean less than ugly honesty. Margaret set aside her sketching, curled into his side on the bench he'd built specifically to fit them both. We were cargo they didn't want, she said quietly, watching the fire. Delivered to the wrong address, marked return to sender. But instead of going back, we decided to stay, right here, right where we landed. And now we're home. Home, Elijah agreed, the word carrying weight it never had before. Home wasn't just the cabin anymore, wasn't just the claim or the mountain. It was Margaret beside him, their child growing beneath her heart, Rose sleeping safely in the corner, the life they'd built from the wreckage of what they'd lost. Outside, An owl called across the meadow, the same sound that had echoed that first night. But now it seemed less lonely, more like a greeting between friends. The fire crackled. Rose shifted in her sleep, and Margaret traced absent patterns on Elijah's hand. "I've been thinking about names," Margaret said. "For the baby. Oh, if it's a girl, Hope, because that's what she'll be. Proof that good things can come from bad beginnings. And if it's a boy," Margaret smiled, "Chance, because that's what we took on each other. And look where it led us." They sat in comfortable silence, planning their future while Rose slept and the fire burned low. In the morning, there would be work, the claim to tend, the addition to complete, a young woman to train in the rhythms of mountain life. But tonight, they had this: the quiet triumph of lives rebuilt, love discovered, and kindness passed forward. The empty platform at Copper Ridge Station would see other abandoned souls, other public failures and private heartbreaks. But now there was a precedent, a story the town would tell despite itself. The Mountainman and the abandoned bride who'd married in desperation and discovered devotion, who'd taken their own second chance and offered one to another. The letter from the railroad company, announcing the spur line that would bring prosperity to the region, lay on the table beside Margaret's sketches. Their claim would be worth 10 times its current value within a year. But that was just money, just security. The real wealth was here, in the cabin that had become a home, in the partnership that had become a marriage, in the rescue that had become a tradition. Margaret yawned, stood with the careful balance of pregnancy. "Come to bed, husband. Tomorrow's a working day." Elijah banked the fire, checked the door, followed his wife to the bed they now shared without hesitation or doubt. As they settled together, her back to his chest, his hand protective over where their child grew, he thought about the journey from that October morning to this May night. 6 months that had contained a lifetime of change. "No regrets," he whispered into her hair. "None," she whispered back. "Not one. This is exactly where I was meant to be." Outside, spring moved toward summer, the mountains eternal yet somehow different, blessed by the small human drama of love found in the last place anyone would look for it, at the end of the line, where abandoned cargo discovered it was actually treasure, waiting for the right person to recognize its worth. You know, I've told many stories about the frontier, about gold strikes and grand adventures, but this one stays with me differently. Maybe because it reminds me that the most precious things we find are rarely what we went looking for. Elijah and Margaret taught me something about gratitude I hadn't understood before. Not the hollow kind we recite at Sunday dinner, but the fierce gratitude of people who've been empty-handed and know the weight of fullness. They were grateful not for perfection, but for presence, for someone who stayed when staying got hard, who saw them clearly and chose them anyway. And family. They showed me family isn't just blood flowing through shared veins. It's Margaret turning that photograph face down without judgment. It's Elijah building a chest with carved initials. It's both of them seeing Rose on that platform and recognizing their own ghost, then choosing to break the cycle of abandonment. Sometimes we're the cargo nobody ordered, sitting at some station in life, unwanted and lost. But if we're lucky, truly lucky, someone sees past the damage to what we could become together. That's family. That's home. That's the gold that never loses its shine.